The dust from the auctioneer's gavel had barely settled when Josephine Sanders realized she had just spent every last cent she owned on a covered wagon and a chestnut mare that looked about as worn down as she felt. The year was 1867, and Sacramento, California had seen better days, but then again, so had she. Her fingers trembled as she counted the empty coin purse one more time, as if hoping a miracle might produce even a single dollar. But miracles had been in short supply since her father died 3 months ago. The wagon sat in the town square, its canvas top faded and patched in several places, but the wheels were solid and the wooden frame seemed sturdy enough. The mare, which the auctioneer had called Rosie, stood patiently beside it, her brown eyes gentle despite the obvious years of hard work etched into her frame. Josephine approached slowly, running her hand along the mare's neck. At least the horse seemed kind. That was more than she could say for most folks she had encountered lately. "You planning on going somewhere with that rig?" A voice drawled from behind her. Josephine turned to find a man leaning against the post office wall, his dark hair falling across his forehead beneath a dusty brown hat. He was tall, maybe in his mid-20s, with eyes the color of creek water in summer. Something about his stance suggested he had been watching the auction for a while. "I suppose that depends on whether I can figure out how to hitch this horse properly," Josephine admitted, seeing no point in pretending she knew what she was doing. Her father had always handled the animals, and she had focused on keeping house and helping with his small dry goods business. Now the business was gone, sold to pay his debts, and she was alone with nothing but this wagon and horse. The man pushed off from the wall and walked toward her with an easy gait. "Name is Franklin Yates. Most folks call me Frank." He tipped his hat slightly. "I work at the livery down the street. Saw you bid on this outfit." "Josephine Sanders," she replied, unsure whether to be grateful or wary of his approach. Men in Sacramento had a tendency to view a woman alone as either a charity case or an opportunity, and she was not interested in being either. Frank circled the wagon slowly, examining it with a practiced eye. The previous owner was old Tom Henderson. He passed last winter. His widow sold off his things. He paused, running his hand along one of the wheels. "It is a decent wagon. The axles are sound, and the canvas has been treated with linseed oil to keep the rain out. You could do worse." "That is reassuring, considering I cannot afford to do better," Josephine said, then immediately regretted the admission. She did not need this stranger knowing how desperate her situation was, but Frank did not seem to take advantage of the information. Instead, he moved to Rosie and examined her hooves, lifting each one with gentle competence. "The mare is older, maybe 15 years, but she has been well cared for. Her shoes are in good shape and she does not have any obvious lameness." He patted the horse's shoulder. "She will get you where you need to go, long as you do not push her too hard." "And where exactly do you think I need to go?" Josephine asked, crossing her arms. Frank straightened and met her gaze. "Well, seeing as how you just spent what looked like your last money on a wagon and a horse, I would guess you are planning on leaving Sacramento. Most folks who buy a rig like this are either heading to a new homestead or running from something, or both." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "That is hardly your concern." "You are right about that," Frank agreed easily. "But if you are planning on traveling alone, you should know how to handle this setup. And right now, I would wager you do not even know how to put the harness on properly." She wanted to argue, but he was absolutely right. The tangle of leather straps and buckles hanging on the side of the wagon might as well have been a Chinese puzzle for all she understood them. "I can learn," she said stubbornly. "Sure you can," Frank said. "But learning on the trail can get you into trouble fast. A horse that is not properly harnessed can bolt, and then you have got bigger problems than just not knowing what you are doing. Josephine looked at the wagon, then at Rosie, then back at Frank. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Would you teach me? I do not have money to pay you, but I could." She trailed off, uncertain what she could possibly offer. Frank shook his head. "I was not looking for payment. Just seems like the decent thing to do." He gestured toward the harness. "Come on, I will show you the basics." For the next hour, Frank patiently demonstrated how to harness Rosie to the wagon, explaining each strap and buckle. Josephine paid careful attention, asking questions when something was unclear. Frank answered each one without making her feel foolish, which she appreciated more than she could express. By the time they finished, the sun was starting to lower in the western sky, painting Sacramento's dusty streets in shades of gold. "You are a quick study," Frank observed as Josephine successfully completed the harnessing on her second try. "Where did you say you were headed?" "I did not say," Josephine replied. She gathered the reins, feeling their weight in her hands. "But if you must know, I have family in Oregon. An aunt who married a logger. She wrote to my father years ago, said if we ever needed anything, we would be welcome." Frank's eyebrows rose. "Oregon, that is a long haul from here, especially for someone traveling alone." "I am aware of the distance," Josephine said. "But there is nothing for me here anymore. My father's debts took everything we had, the house, the shop, even most of my mother's things." Her voice caught slightly on the last part, but she pushed through. "This wagon and Rosie are all I have left, and I intend to make the most of them." "Oregon," Frank repeated, looking thoughtful. "You know the trail through the mountains will be rough this time of year. It is already late September. You hit snow up there, and this wagon will not help you much." "Then I had better not waste time," Josephine said. She climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. The height felt precarious, and she was acutely aware of how little she knew about controlling a horse from this position. Frank stepped back, his expression troubled. "Miss Sanders, I do not mean to overstep, but heading out alone with winter coming on is dangerous. Maybe you should wait until spring." "And live on what through the winter?" Josephine asked. "I have no money, no home, and no prospects here. At least in Oregon I have family." "You have family you have never met," Frank pointed out. "What if they cannot take you in? What if something has changed since that letter was written?" Josephine had considered these possibilities during many sleepless nights since her father's death. "Then I will figure something out." "I always have." Frank studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. "Hold on a minute," he said suddenly. "Just wait right here." Before Josephine could respond, he turned and strode quickly down the street toward the livery. She sat on the wagon seat, uncertain whether to wait or simply start her journey. Rosie shifted in her harness, and Josephine gently pulled the reins, testing how the mare responded. The horse moved backward a few steps, then stopped. At least that worked. Frank returned within 10 minutes, slightly out of breath. "I just sold my saddle and tack to the livery owner," he announced. "Got enough to cover supplies for the trail." Josephine stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because I am coming with you," Frank said simply. He swung himself up onto the wagon seat beside her before she could protest. "You need someone who knows the trail, and I have been meaning to head north anyway. My brother has a ranch up past Portland. I have been putting off visiting for too long." "You cannot just decide to come with me," Josephine protested. Even as part of her felt a rush of relief at the thought of not traveling alone. "You do not even know me." "I know you are brave enough to risk everything on a chance at a better life," Frank said. "And I know you are proud enough that you will probably get yourself killed rather than admit you need help. Those seem like pretty good reasons to tag along." Josephine wanted to argue, but exhaustion and fear had been her constant companions for months, and the thought of facing the long journey alone suddenly felt overwhelming. "I cannot pay you," she said quietly. "I told you I have nothing." "Did not ask for payment," Frank replied. He took the reins from her hands, his fingers warm where they brushed against hers. "Now we should get moving if we want to make it out of town before dark. There is a good camping spot about 5 miles north, near the river. We can stop there for the night." "Just like that?" Josephine asked. "You are just going to leave everything behind?" Frank clicked his tongue and Rosie started forward, the wagon creaking into motion. "Everything I care about can fit in a saddlebag, and I already grabbed it from my room at the boarding house. The livery owner was not sorry to see me go. I only worked there because I needed the money to get north, and now I have enough for supplies." He glanced at her. "Sometimes the best decisions are the quick ones." As the wagon rolled through Sacramento streets, Josephine watched the familiar buildings pass by. The mercantile where her father had bought supplies, the church where her mother was buried, the schoolhouse where she had learned to read. Every landmark held a memory, and leaving them behind felt both terrifying and liberating. They stopped at the general store, where Frank used his newly acquired money to purchase flour, salt pork, coffee, beans, and other essentials for the trail. The storekeeper eyed them curiously, clearly trying to determine their relationship, but Frank ignored the unspoken questions and simply loaded the supplies into the wagon. "We will need to be smart about rationing," Frank explained as they continued north. "It is about 600 miles to Oregon, maybe more depending on the route we take. In good conditions, a wagon can cover 15 to 20 miles a day, but we will hit rough country in the mountains." Josephine did the mental calculation. "That is at least a month of travel, probably longer." "Probably longer," Frank agreed, "especially if the weather turns bad. But there are settlements along the way where we can resupply if needed. And I know how to hunt. We will not starve." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Josephine could not shake a nagging feeling of guilt. "You really did not have to sell your saddle," she said. "I would have managed somehow." Frank was quiet for a moment, guiding Rosie around a particularly deep rut in the road. "My father used to say that sometimes God puts opportunities in your path, and you are a fool if you do not take them. I have been drifting for the past year, working odd jobs, telling myself I would visit my brother when I had enough saved up. But the truth is, I was scared." "Scared of what?" Josephine asked. "Of admitting I needed family," Frank said. "My brother and I did not part on the best terms. He wanted to go west and start fresh, and I wanted to stay in Missouri and work our father's farm. We argued, said things we should not have said. He left, and I stayed. Then our parents died and the farm got taken for taxes, and I realized I had nothing left there. But going to see him felt like admitting he was right all along." Josephine understood that kind of pride all too well. "And now I figure life is too short to let stubbornness get in the way of doing the right thing," Frank said. He looked at her. "Helping you get to Oregon safely is the right thing. And maybe once you are settled with your family, I will keep going north and see if my brother will still have me." They reached the camping spot just as the sun touched the horizon. It was a clearing near the Sacramento River, with good grass for Rosie and a fire ring left by previous travelers. Frank unhitched the horse with practiced efficiency, then showed Josephine how to hobble the mare so she could graze without wandering too far. "Always check the area before you settle in for the night," Frank instructed. "Look for animal tracks, signs of recent campfires, anything that might indicate trouble." He pointed to some marks in the dirt. "Those are deer tracks, which is a good sign. Means there is no heavy predator activity nearby. or the deer would not come down to the water. Josephine gathered firewood while Frank started a small fire. The simple act of working together felt surprisingly natural, as if they had known each other far longer than a few hours. As darkness settled over the landscape, they sat by the fire eating beans and salt pork cooked in a small iron skillet. "Tell me about your aunt," Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What is she like?" "I do not really know," Josephine admitted. "She is my mother's sister. They were close growing up, but after my aunt married, her husband took her west to work in the logging camps. That was almost 15 years ago. She wrote letters at first, describing the big trees and the mountains. My mother used to read them to me." She stared into the fire. "After my mother died, my father and I kept to ourselves mostly. We got one letter from my aunt about 5 years ago, saying they had settled near a town called Astoria and that we should come visit. My father always meant to write back, but he never did." "So she might not even know you are coming," Frank said carefully. "No, she would not," Josephine confirmed. "But the letter was very clear about us being welcome. And my Aunt Alina is not the kind of person to make promises she does not mean. At least she was not when my mother knew her." Frank poked at the fire with a stick. "People can change in 15 years. So can circumstances," Josephine countered. "A few months ago, I thought I would spend the rest of my life running my father's store. Now here I am, heading to Oregon with a man I met this afternoon. If I can change that much in a few months, I suppose my aunt could have changed too, but I have to believe some things stay constant. Family is family." "Family is family," Frank repeated softly. "I hope you are right about that, for both our sakes." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the river and the crackling fire. Josephine found herself studying Frank in the flickering light. He had a kind face, she decided, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. His hands were calloused from hard work, but they had been gentle with Rosie and patient while teaching her about the harness. "Why did you really decide to come with me?" she asked suddenly. "And do not say it was just about heading north anyway. You could have traveled faster on your own if you had kept your horse and saddle." Frank met her gaze across the fire. "Honestly, when I saw you at that auction, bidding everything you had on a wagon and a horse, I saw something that has been missing from my own life for too long." "What is that?" "Purpose," Frank said. "You were not just buying a wagon. You were buying a chance at a new beginning, and you were willing to risk everything for it. I have been drifting for a year, working jobs I do not care about, saving money without really knowing why. Watching you, I realized I have been afraid to want anything because wanting something means you can lose it. But you lost everything and you are still fighting. That is brave." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "I do not feel brave. I feel terrified." "Being brave does not mean you are not scared," Frank said. "It means you keep going even when you are scared, and I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to help someone who is actually trying to build something instead of just surviving." "And if we make it to Oregon?" Josephine asked. "What then?" Frank smiled. "Then you will be with your family, and I will go see my brother, and maybe we will both have new beginnings. And maybe, if you are not opposed to it, I could come back to Astoria now and then. Make sure you are settling in all right." Something warm unfurled in Josephine's chest, a feeling she had not experienced since before her father got sick. It was not quite hope, but it was close. "I think I would like that," she said softly. That night, Josephine slept in the wagon while Frank made a bedroll near the fire. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness and thinking about the man who had so unexpectedly joined her journey. It was reckless to trust someone she had just met, but somehow it felt right. Maybe Frank was correct about quick decisions sometimes being the best ones. The next morning, they were up with the dawn. Frank showed Josephine how to make coffee over the campfire and how to pack the wagon efficiently so the weight was properly distributed. Every task was a lesson, and Josephine absorbed the information eagerly, knowing her survival might depend on these skills. As they traveled north over the following days, a comfortable routine developed. Frank handled most of the driving at first, but he gradually let Josephine take the reins more often, coaching her through difficult terrain and teaching her how to read Rosie's signals. The mare, despite her age, proved to be steady and reliable, and Josephine grew fond of her. The landscape changed as they moved away from Sacramento, the flat valley giving way to rolling hills covered in golden grass. They passed other travelers occasionally, exchanging news and warnings about road conditions ahead. Frank had an easy way with strangers, able to get useful information without revealing too much about their own plans. One afternoon, about a week into their journey, they stopped at a small settlement to resupply. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon, but it was a chance to refill their water barrels and buy fresh bread. While Frank negotiated with the store owner over the price of flour, Josephine wandered outside and found herself face to face with a young woman about her own age. The woman was dressed in worn calico, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You heading north?" the woman asked without preamble. "Yes," Josephine replied cautiously. "To Oregon." The woman's eyes widened. "With winter coming, that is brave or foolish, I cannot decide which." "Maybe a bit of both," Josephine admitted. She gestured toward the wagon. "We are hoping to make it through the mountains before the worst of the snow." The woman asked, glancing toward the store where Frank was visible through the window. "Is that your husband?" "No," Josephine said quickly. "He is just someone who is traveling in the same direction. We are helping each other out." The woman gave her a long, appraising look. "Be careful with that. Folks will talk, you know. A man and woman traveling alone together, not being married. Some people would not understand." Josephine had not really considered what others might think of their arrangement. She had been too focused on surviving each day to worry about propriety. "Let them talk," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We are not doing anything wrong." "I am not saying you are," the woman said gently. "Just warning you that the world can be harsh on women who do not follow the expected path. I know that from experience." She extended her hand. "I am Margaret, by the way. My husband and I run the general store." Josephine shook her hand. "Josephine, and thank you for the warning. I will keep it in mind." Frank emerged from the store carrying a sack of supplies. He tipped his hat to Margaret, then helped Josephine load the goods into the wagon. As they prepared to leave, Margaret approached one more time. "There is a good camping spot about 10 miles north," she said, "near a creek with a stand of oak trees. You will know it when you see it. And Miss Josephine, take care of yourself. The trail ahead is not easy." As they drove away, Frank glanced at Josephine. "What was that about?" "Just a friendly warning about the dangers of traveling with a man I am not married to," Josephine said wryly. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you? What people might think?" "A few months ago it would have," Josephine admitted. "But I have lost so much that worrying about gossip seems trivial. Besides, you have been nothing but respectful." "And I will continue to be," Frank assured her, "though Margaret has a point about one thing. There are people who would not understand our arrangement, and some of them might be less kind about expressing their opinions. We should be prepared for that." They found the camping spot Margaret had mentioned just before dusk. It was as described, a pleasant clearing near a burbling creek with a ring of oak trees that would provide good shelter from the wind. Frank unhitched Rosie while Josephine started gathering firewood, their routine now smooth and efficient. As they sat by the fire that night, eating a stew Frank had made from dried venison and wild onions he had found near the creek, Josephine found herself watching him again. Over the past week, she had learned that he was patient and kind, quick to laugh but serious when necessary. He never talked down to her, always explaining things clearly and giving her space to learn from her mistakes. "Can I ask you something personal?" Josephine said suddenly. Frank looked up from his bowl. "You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask. Have you ever been in love?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He set down his bowl and stared into the fire for a long moment. "Once," he finally said. "Her name was Catherine. We grew up together back in Missouri. Everyone assumed we would get married eventually." "What happened?" "My brother happened," Frank said. "He and Catherine fell in love, though neither of them meant for it to happen. She came to tell me before they left for Oregon together. Said she was sorry, that she cared about me but did not love me the way a wife should love a husband." He smiled sadly. "She was right, of course. I was angry at the time, felt betrayed. That is part of why I said such harsh things when my brother left. But looking back, I think I was more hurt that my plans had changed than that I had lost her specifically." Josephine absorbed this information. "So your brother and Catherine are in Oregon together?" "They were married before they left," Frank confirmed. "I got a letter from him about 6 months ago, telling me they had a daughter. He said he was sorry for how things happened, that he hoped someday I could forgive him. I never wrote back." "Is that what you are afraid of?" Josephine asked gently. "Seeing them together, partly," Frank admitted. "But mostly I am afraid that too much time has passed, that the things I said cannot be taken back. What if he does not want to see me? What if I hurt him too badly?" "You will never know unless you try," Josephine said. "And from what you have told me about your brother, he reached out to you. That means he wants to repair things. You just have to be brave enough to let him." Frank laughed softly. "Are you using my own words against me?" "Maybe," Josephine said with a small smile. "But they are true words. You told me that being brave means keeping going even when you are scared. That applies to you too." "When did you get so wise?" Frank asked, his eyes warm in the firelight. "I have had a lot of time to think about courage and fear lately," Josephine replied. "Losing my father taught me that sometimes the scariest thing is also the most necessary thing. I was terrified to spend my last money on that wagon, terrified to leave Sacramento, terrified to trust a stranger. But the alternative was staying somewhere I had no future, letting fear trap me in a life that was already over." Frank reached across the space between them and gently took her hand. The gesture was simple, but it sent warmth spreading through Josephine's entire body. "I am glad I met you, Josephine Sanders. You have reminded me what it means to actually live instead of just exist." "I am glad I met you too," Josephine whispered. "I do not think I could have done this alone." They sat like that for a while, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to embers. When they finally separated to prepare for sleep, Josephine felt changed somehow, as if something important had shifted between them. The next 2 weeks tested them in ways neither had anticipated. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed into the foothills, and the autumn weather became increasingly unpredictable. They endured rainstorms that turned the trail to mud, forcing them to stop and wait for the ground to dry enough for the wagon to pass safely. Twice they had to unload the entire wagon to get it across particularly difficult creek crossings. Through it all, Frank remained patient and steady, and Josephine discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. They worked together seamlessly now, anticipating each other's needs and moving in quiet synchronization that came from shared purpose. One evening, as they made camp in the shadow of towering pine trees, Frank taught Josephine how to shoot his rifle. You should know how to protect yourself, he said. Not just from animals, but from people too. The trail can bring out the worst in some folks. Josephine had never held a gun before, and the weight of the rifle felt foreign in her hands. Frank stood behind her, his arms around hers as he showed her how to sight down the barrel and squeeze the trigger gently. The closeness of him was distracting, and her first shot went wide of the target he had set up. "Try again," Frank encouraged, his breath warm against her ear. "Focus on the front sight, not the target. Let it be a surprise when the gun goes off." On her third try, Josephine managed to hit the piece of wood Frank had propped against a tree. The kick of the rifle jarred her shoulder, but the satisfaction of seeing the wood splinter was worth it. "Good," Frank said, stepping back. "Practice a few more times until it feels natural." By the time darkness fell, Josephine could hit the target reliably, though her shoulder ached from the repeated recoil. Frank showed her how to clean and load the rifle, then presented her with a small pistol he had been carrying in his pack. "This belonged to my father," he said. "It is easier to handle than the rifle, but the range is not as good. Keep it with you, especially when we are passing through towns or near mining camps, just in case." Josephine accepted the gun carefully. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "I trust you with a lot more than a gun," Frank said quietly. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Josephine found herself stepping closer, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand. Frank reached up and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek. "Josephine," he murmured, "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, a sound in the darkness made them both freeze. Frank immediately reached for his rifle, positioning himself between Josephine and the source of the noise. They stood motionless, listening. After a tense moment, a deer emerged from the trees, pausing to look at them before bounding away. Frank lowered the rifle, releasing a breath. Just a deer. But the moment between them had broken, and whatever Frank had been about to say remained unsaid. They prepared for sleep in their usual manner, Frank taking the first watch while Josephine settled into the wagon. But Josephine lay awake, replaying the almost moment in her mind and wondering what Frank had wanted to tell her. The answer came a few days later as they approached the Oregon border. They had stopped to rest Rosie near a small stream when Frank suddenly turned to Josephine with an intensity she had not seen before. "I have to say this before we reach Oregon," he began, "before we get caught up in reunions with family and new beginnings. I need you to know that these past weeks with you have been the happiest I have been in years, maybe ever." Josephine's heart began to race. "Frank, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we have not known each other long. I know this started as just two people traveling in the same direction. But somewhere along the way it became more than that, at least for me." "For me too," Josephine admitted. "But I do not know what that means, where we go from here." Frank took her hands in his. "I do not have all the answers either, but I know I do not want this to end when we reach Astoria. I know I want to keep seeing you, getting to know you, building something with you." "What about your brother?" Josephine asked. "Your plans?" "My brother is near Portland, which is not far from Astoria," Frank said. "I have been thinking about it, and I realize now that I do not have to choose between seeing him and being near you. I can do both, if you want me to." Josephine felt tears welling up. "I want that. I want you to stay close. These weeks traveling with you, I have felt more like myself than I have since my mother died. You see me, really see me, not just as someone's daughter or someone who needs help." Frank pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "You are the strongest person I have ever met, and the kindest. And somewhere along this crazy journey, I fell completely in love with you." Josephine tilted her head back to look at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You love me?" "Yes," Frank said simply. "I love you, Josephine Sanders. I love your courage and your determination. I love the way you never give up, even when things are hard. I love how you learn something new and immediately want to understand everything about it. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you talk to Rosie like she is a person." He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, and I know it is fast and probably crazy, but it is true." "It is not crazy," Josephine whispered, "because I love you too. I have been trying not to admit it, telling myself it was too soon or too complicated, but my heart does not care about any of that. I love you, Franklin Yates." Frank smiled, and it was like the sun coming out after a storm. Then he kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Josephine felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit back together. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, and Josephine lost herself in the feeling of being held and wanted and loved. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I was so afraid you would not feel the same way." "I was afraid too," Josephine confessed. "Afraid that wanting this meant I would lose it. Every time I have let myself care about something, it has been taken away. My mother, my father, my home. I was scared to care about you because I could not bear to lose you too." "You are not going to lose me," Frank promised. "I am here, and I am staying. However this works out with your aunt and my brother, we will figure it out together." They reached the Oregon border 3 days later, crossing into the territory with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The landscape was dramatically different from California, with thick forests of massive trees and mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. Rain fell more frequently here, soft and persistent, but Rosie plodded on faithfully and the wagon held up well. As they traveled north along the Willamette Valley, Frank became quieter, clearly thinking about the reunion with his brother. Josephine tried to offer reassurance, but she understood that some fears could only be faced, not talked away. They decided to stop in Portland first, reasoning that it was on the way to Astoria and Frank needed to confront his past before they could move forward. The city was bustling with activity when they arrived, ships crowding the docks and the streets full of loggers, merchants, and settlers. Frank's brother, Frederick, owned a small ranch on the outskirts of town. They found it after asking directions from a helpful stable owner. The property was modest but well-maintained, with a neat house and a barn surrounded by fenced pastures where cattle grazed. Frank sat frozen on the wagon seat staring at the house. Josephine gently touched his arm. "Do you want me to wait here?" "No," Frank said quickly. "I need you with me, please." They climbed down from the wagon and approached the house together. Before they could knock, the door opened, and a man who looked remarkably like Frank stepped out. He was a bit taller and his hair was lighter, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. "Frank," Frederick said, his voice full of disbelief. "Is that really you?" "Hello, Fred," Frank said quietly. "I got your letter. I am sorry it took me so long to respond." Frederick crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled Frank into a fierce embrace. "I do not care how long it took. You are here now. That is what matters." Frank returned the embrace, and Josephine saw tears streaming down both men's faces. She felt her own eyes well up at the sight of their reconciliation. "I am sorry," Frank said, his voice muffled against his brother's shoulder. "I am so sorry for the things I said. For being too stubborn to see that you and Catherine were perfect for each other. For wasting all this time being angry." "I am sorry too," Frederick replied. "I should have been honest with you from the start, instead of letting you find out the way you did. And I should have tried harder to make you understand that I still needed my brother, even if things had changed." They pulled apart, wiping their eyes and laughing at themselves. Frederick finally seemed to notice Josephine standing nearby. "I am sorry. Where are my manners? Who is this?" Frank reached back and took Josephine's hand, drawing her forward. "This is Josephine Sanders. She is the woman I love." Frederick's eyebrows shot up, but he smiled warmly. "Well, that is wonderful news. Come inside, both of you. Catherine will want to meet you, and our daughter Alice has been asking for weeks when Uncle Frank would visit. She is only 2, but somehow she heard us talking about you and decided you needed to come see her." Inside the house, they found Catherine in the kitchen, a toddler playing on the floor near her feet. Catherine was a pretty woman with dark hair and kind eyes, and she greeted Frank with genuine warmth, though Josephine could sense some nervousness in her manner. "Frank, it is so good to see you," Catherine said. "I hope you can forgive us for the pain we caused you." "There is nothing to forgive," Frank said sincerely. "I was hurt at the time, but I can see now that things worked out the way they were meant to. You and Fred are happy, and I found my own happiness." He squeezed Josephine's hand. "Everything happened exactly as it should have." Little Alice toddled over to Frank, looking up at him with curious eyes. "Uncle," she asked. Frank crouched down to her level. "That is right, I am your Uncle Frank." Alice considered this for a moment, then threw her arms around his neck in a trusting hug that made everyone laugh. They spent the evening sharing stories and catching up on lost time. Josephine found herself warmly welcomed into the family, with Frederick and Catherine asking about her journey and her plans. When Josephine mentioned her aunt in Astoria, Catherine's face lit up. "We know some people in Astoria," she said. "It is a wonderful community, very welcoming. I am sure your aunt will be delighted to see you." As the evening grew late, Frederick offered them the use of his barn to sleep in, saying they were welcome to stay as long as they wanted. Frank and Josephine gratefully accepted, and after putting Rosie in one of the stalls with fresh hay and water, they made beds in the loft. Lying in the sweet-smelling hay, listening to the rain patter on the roof, Josephine felt a peace she had not known in months. Frank pulled her close and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for being here with me today," Frank murmured into her hair. "I could not have done that without you." "Yes, you could have," Josephine said, "but I am glad you did not have to." Frank kissed the top of her head. "Tomorrow we will head to Astoria and find your aunt, and then we will start figuring out our future." "Our future," Josephine repeated, loving the sound of those words. "Together, together," Frank agreed. They left for Astoria the next morning after a hearty breakfast with Frederick's family. The route took them northwest through more dense forests, following the road that paralleled the Columbia River. The journey took 2 days, with both Frank and Josephine growing increasingly nervous as they approached their destination. Astoria sat at the mouth of the Columbia River, a bustling port town filled with the sounds of sawmills and ship traffic. The smell of cut timber and salt water filled the air. Frank and Josephine drove slowly through the streets, looking for someone who might know Alina and her husband. At the general store, an elderly man behind the counter listened to Josephine's inquiry and nodded. "Alina Mason. Sure, I know her. She and her husband Tom live about a mile outside town, on the road toward the headland. They have got a nice little place with some chickens and a vegetable garden. Tom does carpentry work mostly these days, retired from the logging camps a few years back." Armed with directions, they found the house easily. It was a small but well-built cottage with a garden out front and a chicken coop to one side. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. Josephine's hands trembled as Frank helped her down from the wagon. "What if she does not remember me? I was only 8 when she left." "Then you will remind her," Frank said encouragingly. "Come on, I will be right beside you." They knocked on the door, and after a moment, It opened to reveal a woman in her mid-40s with graying brown hair and eyes the exact same shade as Josephine's mother had had. Recognition flickered across Alina's face as she studied Josephine. "Dear Lord," Alina breathed. "You look just like Sarah. You must be little Josie." "I prefer Josephine now," Josephine said, her voice shaking. "But yes, I am Sarah's daughter." Alina pulled her into a tight embrace, crying openly. "Oh, my dear girl, where is your father? Is he here? And Sarah, please tell me she is well." Josephine's composure crumbled and she found herself sobbing in her aunt's arms. "They are gone. Both of them. Mama died when I was 12 and Papa died 3 months ago. I had nowhere else to go, and I remembered your letter saying we would be welcome, so I came." Alina held her tighter. "Of course you are welcome. This is your home now for as long as you need it." She pulled back to look at Josephine's face, then noticed Frank standing nearby. "And who is this young man?" "This is Frank," Josephine said, wiping her eyes. "He helped me get here. We fell in love along the way." Alina smiled through her tears. "Well, that sounds like a story worth hearing. Come inside, both of you. Tom is out back working on a cabinet, but he will be in soon for lunch." The cottage was warm and cozy inside, filled with simple but comfortable furniture. Alina bustled around, making tea and setting out bread and cheese while Josephine and Frank settled at the kitchen table. As they ate, Josephine told her aunt everything that had happened since her mother's death, the struggles with her father's illness, the debts that took everything, and the desperate decision to come to Oregon. Alina listened with tears streaming down her face. "I should have stayed in better touch," she said. "After Sarah died, Tom and I talked about going back to visit, but money was always tight and the journey was so long. I kept meaning to write more often, but life got busy. If I had known you needed help, I would have come." "It is not your fault," Josephine assured her. "Papa did not tell anyone how bad things had gotten. He was too proud." Tom proved to be a burly man with a kind face and a gentle manner. He welcomed Josephine and Frank warmly, and over the next few days they all settled into an easy rhythm. Frank helped Tom with carpentry projects while Josephine spent time with her aunt, learning about the sister her mother had missed so much. Alina shared stories of Josephine's mother as a young woman, full of life and laughter. She showed Josephine old letters Sarah had written, filled with descriptions of Josephine as a baby. Through these stories, Josephine felt connected to her mother again in a way she had not since her death. One evening, about a week after their arrival, Frank asked Tom's permission to speak with him privately. They walked down to the shore, where the massive Columbia River met the Pacific Ocean. Frank had been rehearsing what he wanted to say, but now that the moment had come, the words felt inadequate. "I love your niece," Frank began. "I know we have not known each other very long, but what we have is real. I want to marry her if she will have me. But I wanted to ask your blessing first, since you are the closest thing to a father she has now." Tom studied him for a long moment. "What can you offer her? Do you have work, a place to live?" "Not yet," Frank admitted, "but I am a hard worker and I learn fast. I was thinking I could apprentice with you, learn the carpentry trade properly. Frederick mentioned there is high demand for skilled carpenters in the area, and until Josephine and I can afford our own place, I was hoping we might be able to stay with you and Alina, if that would be acceptable. I would pay rent and help with the expenses." Tom smiled. "You have given this real thought. That is good. Alina would skin me alive if I did anything to prevent Josephine's happiness, but I needed to make sure you were serious about this." "I am more serious about this than I have ever been about anything," Frank said. "Josephine is everything to me." "Then you have my blessing," Tom said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the family, son." Frank shook his hand gratefully. "Thank you, sir. I will take good care of her, I promise." The next day, Frank took Josephine for a walk along the beach. The Oregon coast was wild and beautiful, with massive rock formations rising from the surf and seabirds wheeling overhead. They walked in comfortable silence until Frank led her to a sheltered spot among the dunes. "I have something I need to ask you," Frank said, taking both her hands in his. "These past weeks with you have changed my whole life. You have shown me what it means to be truly brave, to fight for what you want instead of just accepting what life gives you. You have made me believe in love again, in family, in the possibility of building something real and lasting." Josephine's heart was pounding so hard she thought Frank must surely be able to hear it. "Frank, let me finish," he said with a gentle smile. "I know I do not have much to offer right now. No land, no house, just a willingness to work hard and build a life with you. But if you are willing to take a chance on me, I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy. Josephine Sanders, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Josephine's face as she nodded vigorously. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Frank pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, and Josephine felt like her heart might burst from happiness. All the loss and pain of the past years seemed to fade in the face of this overwhelming joy. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the local church. Frederick and Catherine came down from Portland with baby Alice, and half the town of Astoria turned out to celebrate. Eleanor cried through the entire ceremony, telling anyone who would listen how proud Sarah would have been to see her daughter so happy. Frank and Josephine moved into a small room in Tom and Eleanor's cottage, saving money while Frank apprenticed as a carpenter. Tom was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, and Frank took to the work naturally. Within 6 months, he was taking on small projects of his own, building furniture and doing repairs for neighbors. Josephine found work helping at the general store, using the skills she had learned in her father's shop. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Patterson, was grateful for competent help and treated Josephine well. Between her wages and Frank's growing income, they were able to start saving for their own place. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Frank and Josephine grew deeper in love with each passing day, learning each other's habits and quirks. They took long walks on the beach in the evenings, talking about their dreams for the future. Frank wanted to eventually open his own carpentry shop, and Josephine dreamed of having a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. 2 years after their wedding, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. Frank was overjoyed, immediately starting work on a cradle despite Josephine's laughing protests that they had months before they would need it. Eleanor fussed over Josephine constantly, making sure she rested enough and ate properly. Their son was born on a spring morning, healthy and loud. They named him Thomas Franklin, after both his grandfathers. Frank held his son with tears streaming down his face, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features. "We made this," he whispered to Josephine. "We made a whole person. We made a family," Josephine corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "Just like we planned." When Thomas was 6 months old, Frank surprised Josephine with news that he had purchased land on the edge of town. "It is not much," he said, "just 3 acres. But it is ours. We can build our own house there, have that garden you have been wanting." Josephine cried with happiness as they walked the property together, Frank pointing out where the house would go and where they could plant fruit trees. With help from Tom, Frederick, and several friends they had made in Astoria, the house began to take shape. Frank poured all his skill into making it perfect, with large windows to catch the light and a wide porch where they could sit on summer evenings. They moved into their new home when Thomas was a year old. It was small but beautifully crafted, every joint tight and every surface smooth. Josephine spent happy hours planting her garden and arranging their modest furniture. The house filled with love and laughter as Thomas grew into a cheerful toddler. 3 years later, their daughter was born. They named her Sarah Eleanor, after both their mothers. She had Josephine's eyes and Frank's smile, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from the moment she arrived. Frank proved to be a devoted father, patient with Thomas's endless questions and gentle with Sarah's infant needs. Frank's carpentry business thrived as his reputation for quality work spread. He hired 2 apprentices and expanded his workshop. Josephine continued working at the general store part-time, enjoying the interaction with customers and the sense of contribution it gave her. Eleanor and Tom were frequent visitors, doting on their great niece and nephew. Frederick and Catherine also visited regularly, and the 2 brothers maintained the close relationship they had rebuilt. Frank often said that reconciling with Frederick was one of the best decisions he had ever made, second only to climbing onto that wagon with Josephine years ago. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Josephine back to the beach where he had proposed. The children were spending the night with Eleanor and Tom, giving them rare time alone. They walked hand in hand along the shore, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "You ever think about that day in Sacramento?" Frank asked. "When you spent everything on that wagon and horse, all the time," Josephine said. "It was the scariest thing I had ever done. I was so certain I was making a terrible mistake. And now," Josephine smiled up at him, "now I know it was the best decision I ever made. That wagon brought me to you. It brought me to a life I could never have imagined." Frank pulled her close. "I sold that wagon and Rosie to a family heading to California. Got a good price for them too. But before I let them go, I took one of the wooden slats from the wagon bed. I have been saving it for the right project." "What project?" Josephine asked curiously. "This one," Frank said, pulling a small wooden box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a beautifully carved pendant on a delicate chain. The pendant was in the shape of a wagon wheel, intricate and perfect. "I made it from that piece of the wagon." "The wagon that brought us together," Josephine gasped, reaching for the pendant with trembling fingers. "Frank, it is beautiful." He fastened it around her neck. "I wanted you to have something that represents how we started. How you were brave enough to risk everything, and how I was smart enough to follow you." Josephine threw her arms around him, kissing him deeply. "I love you so much, even more than I did that day on the trail when you first told me. I did not think it was possible to love someone as much as I love you," Frank murmured against her lips. "And yet somehow it keeps growing." They stood on the beach as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars come out one by one. The sound of the waves provided a gentle rhythm to their quiet conversation about the past and the future. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow. 2 more children joined them, another son they named Frederick James, and a daughter they called Catherine Rose. The house expanded along with the family, with Frank adding rooms as needed. The garden flourished under Josephine's care, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for her to enjoy. Thomas grew into a serious young man who apprenticed with his father, showing a natural talent for woodworking. Sarah proved to be clever and independent, helping her mother at the store and dreaming of one day opening her own shop. The younger children were still finding their way, but they were surrounded by love and encouragement. Eleanor and Tom aged gracefully, content in their sunset years to be surrounded by the family they had helped build. Tom taught his great-grandsons carpentry tricks, while Eleanor shared her recipes and gardening knowledge with the girls. When Tom passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, the whole community mourned, and Frank gave the eulogy, speaking of the man who had become the father he needed. Eleanor lived another 5 years, spending her final days in the house Frank and Josephine had built, surrounded by her beloved family. Her last words to Josephine were, "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you became and the life you built. I am proud, too." Frederick and Catherine remained close friends as well as family. Their children grew up alongside Frank and Josephine's, creating bonds that would last generations. The two brothers often worked together on large projects, combining their skills and enjoying each other's company. As Frank and Josephine entered their 50s, they found themselves with a house that echoed with the sounds of grandchildren instead of their own children. Thomas had married a sweet girl from town and given them 2 grandsons. Sarah had indeed opened her own dress shop in Astoria, which was thriving. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Josephine turned to Frank with a contented smile. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? When you climbed onto the wagon and announced you were coming with me," Frank thought back across the decades. "I said a lot of things that day. You said that sometimes the best decisions are the quick ones," Josephine reminded him, "and you were right. You made a quick decision to join me, and it changed both our lives." Frank took her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her skin. "Best decision I ever made. Well, that and deciding to tell you I loved you when we reached Oregon, and deciding to ask you to marry me. And deciding to stay in Astoria instead of drifting again." Josephine laughed. "So many good decisions. All leading back to you," Frank said. "Everything good in my life comes back to you." They sat in peaceful silence, watching the light fade from the sky. The pendant Frank had made still hung around Josephine's neck, worn smooth from years of wear. The wagon and horse that had started their journey were long gone, but the love they had found endured. When they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire town came out for the party. Frank and Josephine stood surrounded by their children, grandchildren, Frederick's family, and countless friends they had made over the decades. As Frank raised a glass to toast his wife, his voice was strong despite his years. 40 years ago, I met a woman who had just spent everything she had on a wagon and a horse," he said. "She was heading into an uncertain future with nothing but courage and determination. I thought I was doing her a favor by offering to help, but the truth is, she saved me. She gave me a reason to stop drifting and start building. She gave me love, family, and a life beyond anything I had dreamed possible. To Josephine, the bravest person I have ever known. To Josephine." Everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Josephine's eyes were wet with happy tears. "And to Frank," she said, "who saw me when I felt invisible, who believed in me when I doubted myself, and who chose to climb aboard that wagon and share my journey. I was heading to Oregon looking for family, and I found so much more. I found my home, my heart, and my forever." As the party continued around them, Frank pulled Josephine close, and they danced slowly, lost in their own world. The years had added lines to their faces and silver to their hair, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. Their final years were peaceful ones, spent in the house they had built together, surrounded by the family they had created. They took daily walks when weather permitted, hands clasped tight, still finding new things to talk about after all their years together. Frank continued to do small carpentry projects in his workshop, while Josephine tended her garden and doted on her growing number of great-grandchildren. When Frank developed a persistent cough that gradually worsened, they both knew what it meant. The doctor confirmed it was his lungs, weakened from years of breathing in sawdust. Frank faced the news with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. "I am not afraid," he told Josephine one evening as they sat together in their bedroom. "I have lived a full life, loved deeply, and left something good behind. Not everyone can say that. "I am not ready to lose you," Josephine said, her voice breaking. Frank pulled her into his arms. "You will never lose me. I will be in every board of this house, every piece of furniture I made, every story our grandchildren tell, and I will be waiting for you whenever you are ready to join me." Frank passed away on a spring morning, holding Josephine's hand. His last words were, "Thank you for letting me climb aboard." Josephine grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren. She continued to live in their house, maintaining Frank's workshop exactly as he had left it. She would often sit in there, surrounded by his tools and half-finished projects, feeling his presence strongly. She wore the wagon wheel pendant every day, touching it whenever she needed to feel close to Frank. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about the journey from Sacramento to Oregon, about a young woman who risked everything and a cowboy who decided to help. The stories took on a mythical quality, teaching about courage, love, and the power of taking chances. Josephine lived to be 87 years old, surrounded by 4 generations of the family she and Frank had created. On her final day, her children gathered around her bed in the house Frank had built. As the afternoon light streamed through the windows, Josephine smiled peacefully. "He is waiting for me," she whispered. "I can see him right there by the door, just like he was that day in Sacramento, still handsome, still patient, still mine." Sarah, now a grandmother herself, squeezed her mother's hand. "What is he doing, Mama?" Josephine's smile widened. "He is holding out his hand. He wants to help me climb aboard." She took one more breath, peaceful and easy, and then she was gone. They buried Josephine next to Frank in the Astoria cemetery, overlooking the ocean they had both loved. The entire town came to pay respects to a woman who had become a pillar of their community. The headstone was carved from the finest wood by their grandson Thomas, who had inherited Frank's skill and Josephine's artistic eye. The house Frank built stood for generations, always occupied by their descendants. The garden Josephine planted continued to bloom each spring. The pendant Frank carved was passed down to their eldest granddaughter, who wore it on her wedding day and then gave it to her own daughter to do the same. The stories of their love endured, told and retold until they became part of the family mythology. In the end, Josephine's desperate gamble in Sacramento had paid off beyond anything she could have imagined. The wagon and horse she bought with everything she had brought her not just to Oregon, but to a life rich with love, family, and purpose. And the cowboy who climbed aboard with her had given her 45 years of partnership, passion, and unwavering devotion. Their love story became legendary in Astoria, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is risk everything on hope. That sometimes the best companions are found in unexpected moments. That love does not follow a timeline or a plan, but finds its own way in its own time. And in the hearts of their descendants, who inherited their courage, their kindness, and their capacity for deep and lasting love, Frank and Josephine lived on, forever young, forever in love, forever climbing aboard together toward an unknown but beautiful future.